Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and start. It's a few minutes after 9. I wanted to make sure everybody got seated. I'd like to begin by, first of all, introducing myself. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill VanPatten. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. And so that you know a little bit about what I do, I'm in two different departments there. I'm in the Department of Romance and Classical Studies. And I'm also in the department, well, it's actually a program within linguistics and Germanic languages. It's a program called Second Language Studies, which is a doctoral program for research on language learning and language teaching. And inside the Department of Romance and Classical Studies, I direct both the language programs in Spanish and French. So if you see Matt Konevsky running around and you see Walter Hopkins running around, they're my assistant directors. Walter's in Spanish and Matt's in French. And that's sort of what we do. And we'll be talking about our Spanish program later this afternoon. So some of the things I'm going to be mentioning today, you can go find out more about how things are implemented, or you can realize how things happen in the afternoon sessions. There's actually 2 afternoon sessions that dovetail quite nicely on those topics. Okay, our topic today is what everyone should know about second language acquisition. And this is kind of a facetious title because who am I to say what everyone should know, right? But I thought of this title because of the theme and purpose of the MiWLA conference this year, which is lines of communication. And what I want to do is open up the lines of communication on the nature of second language acquisition, because something that's become clear to me in this business as a person who works in theory and research, and also with language teachers, is that for some reason, what we know about language acquisition, I have ideas about why not, but things we know about language acquisition just aren't trickling down to people who teach languages. And they're not making their way to commercial publishers. They're not making their way into the mainstream zeitgeist of the people who are actually engaged in language teaching. And we can talk later about why that might be so. So I thought this would be a perfect forum to do this because this is Michigan, and I'm in Michigan, and you're all Michiganders or teaching in Michigan. So we'll start here, and hopefully this can be something that we do repeatedly, and maybe have some ideas later on about how we can make these lines of communication open up even more across the state. Now, my purpose is to provide you some up-to-date thinking from both theoretical and research perspectives. And I want to underscore research or empirical perspectives because this is not just what we think or our best guess. Sure, we work with theory, but we actually have 40 plus years now of tons of empirical data to draw on to make some conclusions about language acquisition. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on that kind of stuff. Now, why spend time on this? Well, because as Sandra Savignon once said to me years ago when I was a young assistant professor, there's nothing more practical than a good theory, which she borrowed from, of course, somebody else in science. And for you to maximize your potentials as language teachers, if you want to teach for communication, if you want to teach for proficiency, is to understand the nature of second language acquisition, including the nature of language. Okay. So I will necessarily be selective in an hour plus the next hour, so 2 hours. We can't talk about everything in second language acquisition, so I'm going to hit 6 major points, and they are the following. We'll preview them. The first one is that what's in your head is not necessarily what you think is there, and it's certainly not what you tell students. Okay. Practice isn't what it's cracked up to be. Communication is distinct from mental representation. And in the second, those are things we'll touch in the first hour. In the second hour, we're going to talk about that you cannot automatically blame the first language for what students are encountering in terms of non-native likeness. Language acquisition, failure, success, whatever, isn't always about aptitude and talents in that regard. And in the end, our final wrap-up, one of the things we're going to do is bring some things together and talk and say how acquisition is just too complex to reduce it to some simple ideas, okay, I might like to give you, for example. And that, in the end, there are no shortcuts to acquisition. Okay, so we're going to start with point 1. Everybody ready? Okay, this is audience participation part. You have lots of audience participation this hour, next hour. Okay, our first point, as we said, our first topic is what's in your head is not necessarily what you think is there. So we're going to take a quick test. You're teachers, you like to give tests, now you're going to take one. Okay, you know that the little suffix re can be added to verbs to mean do again. So for example, like re-record, remake, redo, those all come from record, make, and do. So you add a re in front and you get a verb that means to do again. Okay, so which of the following sentences are possible in English? And just shout out Don't worry, I'm not going to call on you unless I see you sitting there. Okay, so just shut out. So you just say, yeah, that sounds good, or no, it sounds bad. Or you can go, yay, or you can go, eh, whatever you want to do, just say something. Okay, Barack didn't like the color of the walls in the White House, so he repainted the office. Yes. Good sentence, right? Okay, good. Michelle ripped up the parquet in order to resurface the floor. Yes. Okay. Malia was tired when she woke up, so she re-slept a bit. No. Don't like that one, huh? Okay. Sasha petted the dog, and when it wagged its tail, the dog's name is Bo, of course, she re-petted it. No. You don't like that? Okay, so what's the rule for the use of re? Why can you add re with some verbs, but not with other verbs? You all did that test just fine, right? Can anybody tell me? Just the way language develops. Okay, we could always say that. You know, why does my car have that knock in it? I don't know. That's just what cars do. No, we have to have better explanations than that. Okay, let's take another quick test. Okay, you get to keep going here. You're going to love this. All right. Now, we often tell our students and we tell each other that ain't isn't good English, right? Even though little Opie on Andy Griffith used ain't all the time, so did Andy Griffith. And that double negatives are out. Okay, we tell our students in English classes, no, we don't use double negatives in English. But I want you to tell me which of the following two sentences sounds better to you. And I guarantee you that one of them is going to sound better than the others. The first one is, I ain't got none. And the other is, I ain't have any. Boy, your reaction to that second one told me everything, right? You like the first one better, don't you? Okay, even though you might say, oh, we can't use ain't, we can't have double negatives. If you're going to use ain't, you got to do it the first way. You cannot do it the second way. So my question to you is, what's the rule for the correct use of ain't? You as speakers of English have in your heads something that puts constraints on the use of ain't. Even though you might not like it, ain't has a grammar to it, okay? So, and that's in your head. Okay, one final test. All right, here we go. Which of the following are permissible sentences in English? These are questions, okay? So these are about yes-no questions in English. So is this a good yes-no question in English? Does Bill study second language acquisition? You like that sentence? Made you think a little bit more, right? Okay. Now, does study Bill second language acquisition? No. Don't like that one. Okay. Now, studies Bill second language acquisition? Don't like that one? What? Some of you are still staring at the sentence. Why? That should have been an immediate no. Okay. So what's the rule for yes-no question formation in English? But before you answer that, what about Spanish? Is this a good sentence in Spanish? ¿Estudia Bill la adquisición del lenguaje? How about this one? ¿Hace Bill estudiar adquisición del lenguaje? Only if you mean he's making somebody else study, right? Okay. So on the one hand, in English, this sentence, studies Bill, is out, but in Spanish, estudia Bill is perfectly fine to make the same yes-no question. So to answer the question, what's the rule in English, you're automatically telling me in some implicit way that you know what the rule is in Spanish for making yes-no questions. Do you have that information handy for me? You think you do, right? Okay. You don't, unless you're a linguist, and maybe you do. Okay, so we're going to see in a minute. We're going to come back to yes-no questions in a minute. I'm going to warn you that some parts of this first session about what's in your head are going to get a little scary. You're going to freak out. You're going to look at a couple of slides and go, what the? But I will walk you through them. Okay, but we have to get those out of the way in order to talk about some other things. The point of what we're doing in this little demonstration, our test, is that what every speaker or knower of a language creates in the mind or brain is an implicit and abstract system, or some implicit abstract representation of language. Now, this abstract representation bears no resemblance whatsoever to rules as we commonly talk about them. So you might come up with rules for re, rules for ain't, and rules for yes-no question formation and think they sound good, but I guarantee you that those rules you're telling me are not the rules in your head. Okay? And what you come up with, or what's in our heads, I should say, this mental representation bears no resemblance to what's in textbooks or what are pedagogical grammatical rules. And we'll see in a minute what I mean. What I want you to think about and walk away from this is that there are no rules to be learned. That's where we're headed with this first point. Okay? What we're going to see is that there are no rules in the traditional sense to be learned. You are not learning rules, okay? So what's in the head and how does it get there? We're going to go back to yes/no questions. Are you ready? Okay, those little circles are going to be important in a minute. Okay, this is where you're going to go, what the... Okay, I want you to assume for a minute that every sentence in a language, whether it's English, Spanish, Japanese, German, or French, has implicit and hidden structure to it. And this structure is hierarchical, okay? And this structure consists of phrases. There are verb phrases, noun phrases, and other things. Okay, so let's look at what this might be for a very simple English sentence like this. Okay, so Bill studies second language acquisition. What we have here is a syntactic representation for what underlies what we know about language. Now, the part that's in red right here is what we call the lexical part. This is where all the words start before we do things to them. And what's above that is the functional part of the sentence. That's parts of the sentence that aren't lexical in nature, but they have needs that need to be satisfied, which we'll see in a minute. Now, in Spanish, the same sentence in Spanish looks very similar at the beginning. All the stuff that's required lexically is generated in the same part of the sentence, as you can see here. So if you look inside both red circles, Spanish and English basically stick all the words in a sentence in the same spot to begin with. But because there are some functional needs, whoops, now I'm going to draw your attention to the little circles, the little purple circles. There are some functional needs in the functional part of the sentence. Some weird stuff is going to happen to these words to make actual sentences in English and Spanish. So if you look up here under that little C, C stands for clause or complement, because all sentences have this hierarchical structure where this thing called clause dominates everything. There's this little Q, this little T, and that little Q and little T I just stuck there. Those stand for underlying abstract features related to question and tense. Okay, and both Spanish and English have those when you're making questions, yes/no questions. So those Q's and T's need to be satisfied. They're hanging out in there with nothing attached to them. They need something so that this sentence can be good. So what happens in English? Well, in English, we get something interesting going on here. We have to insert a dummy verb in English. And in Spanish, we don't have to insert a dummy verb. We put a dummy verb in English under the T, which is tense. And now that dummy verb, do or does, carries that T feature with it, and it moves out of that spot and up so that that C can get satisfied. You know, like the Rolling Stones, they ain't got no satisfaction. Well, now the C is satisfied. It's okay. Spanish is different from English because each and every verb in Spanish automatically carries this T feature for a variety of reasons. Okay? And what happens is nothing needs to be inserted in the sentence because verbs already have this T feature. And so that what happens is that T rises out of the verb. It actually makes a stop at the T first, but and winds up in the C spot and does the same job in Spanish that the do needs to do for English. So what you have in Spanish and English is the same process, but you have underlying abstract features that are satisfied in two different ways because of the nature of the lexical items in Spanish and English and the way they work. Okay, so that's all in your head. So if you told me, oh, insert do and invert the auxiliary and subject, and in Spanish, invert the verb and the subject, you would be describing the surface part of the sentence to me, but you wouldn't be telling me why. You wouldn't be telling me the underlying actual stuff going on, which is really what's in your head. Okay, now, so what people have in their heads, what I want you to walk away from this, is they have not rules, okay, but an abstract system consisting of these features and operations that are used to satisfy those features. Plus, they have constraints on how those operations, those processes happen. We're not going to get into any detail because it's not a course on syntax. But what you should understand is much of the information that is grammatical in nature is actually stored in lexical items. You only think of words as just being words with meaning, right? But words actually have grammatical information stored in them. So in English, does has a Q feature, a T feature, it's a plus verb and a minus noun. Okay, it's got the feature plus present, it's got the feature minus past, and we put both those in because minus present minus past means future. It's got third person attached to it, it's got singular attached to it, whereas do only has Q, T, plus V, and minus, and it has no other things to it because it's a featureless verb in terms of person, number, and those kinds of things. T stands for tense. Okay, did has a Q feature and a T feature attached to it. Has a V feature and a minus N feature attached to it, and it's minus present plus past because, as we all know, did is past. And then English studies has its meaning, whatever that, notice how do has no meaning, but studies has whatever that meaning is, open a book, or whatever you want to call that. It has plus present, minus past, third person singular, but it has no T feature attached to it. It cannot carry a T feature. Estudia in Spanish has its meaning, the same thing as studies, but it has Q and T features that are embedded in it. Okay, and it's plus V minus N, it's plus plus, has the other features just like English, but what makes estudia different from studies are these two underlying features. So what happens in Spanish is verbs can participate in certain syntactic operations, whereas other verbs in English cannot. Is that a question coming up?
Yeah.
Sure.
So you're saying, for example, the sample you provided was slept and reslept. You're saying that embedded in our brains is the feature that slept can never go with re?
Yeah, and it's actually a semantic feature. It's not a syntactic feature. Because there are various parts of the grammar. And in the case of slept and reslept, there are underlying semantic features that prohibit a re on some verbs. Okay, but it's not a syntactic feature. These are purely syntactic features we're looking at. Yeah. But what I want you to walk away with, what I want you to understand is when I'm talking about rules, I'm talking about rules in the classic sense. Because what we really have now are constraints in language. Okay? Now, let's go on here a little bit. This scenario also questions the reality of paradigms for verbs. So example, a lot of us teach Spanish or French and we go estudio, estudias, estudia, estudiamos, and so on. And the idea is that these paradigms somehow become real to us. Well, are they? What do people really have in their heads, either as native speakers or non-native speakers if they become proficient at language? What they have is this vast interconnected network of words along with their meanings, their inflections, and grammatical information. Okay, so what we have then is and I haven't included all that information on these words. So if we take a word like tomo in Spanish, which means I drink, that has a connection automatically to tomas, which is stored somewhere else, which means you drink or you are drinking. Tomo also has a connection to como, which means I eat. Why? Because they're both about I. Anything that has I embedded in it, first person singular, are all connected in our brain. Okay, so tomo also has a connection to café, because what do you drink? You drink coffee, beer, champagne, whatever. So this verb tomo, and by extension, café is connected to tomas, and any other verb that deals with drink and so on and so forth. And then tomas is connected to comes, because anything that's related to you talking to somebody else, those things are all connected. Okay. Comes is related to como, because they're both about eating. Okay, comes is related to almuerzo, lunch, and cena and everything else, and these are all interconnected. And almuerzo is related to café, because you might have coffee and almuerzo, but café also has multiple meanings. It could also be a place to eat, so you have lunch in a café, and so on. So what you have is this really vast, and I just give you a really simple system here, of super interconnected. It's like, think about the World Wide Web with all its connections among computers. That's what your brain is like with words. Okay, and some connections are stronger than others, obviously for obvious reasons. Okay, but they're all interconnected. All right, so what people have in their heads is this abstract system that governs not only what is possible in the language, but what is not possible. So it governs what makes resurface possible, but reslept impossible. And it also contains a network of lexical entries, all these words, okay, that encode both meaning and grammatical information. There are no rules or paradigms in the classic or traditional sense. And so I'm going to underscore that to speak to your question again. In the classic or traditional sense, there just are no rules, certainly not the kind that we teach or talk about. Now the question becomes, if this is what's in your head, how does it get there? Any takers on this?